James Reston Jr. is a Wilson Center Global Fellow and a prolific author. His latest book, his 18th, is titled A Rift in the Earth, Art, Memory, and the Fight for the Vietnam War Memorial. James, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Terrific book, I should just say up front. Really enjoyed it. Not always the case when you must read a book to interview an author. I want to ask you, what prompted you to write this book now?
Well, there are two things, really. One is that I knew 2.5 years ago that Ken Burns was going to do this extraordinary documentary series. And knowing 2.5 years before a really triumphal, important thing like that is about enough time for an author to do the research and write a book.
Yeah.
It's not quite as easy to hook it right onto the broadcast, but that book was published, or this book was published the day before the first segment.
And Burns gave you a blurb for your cover, calling the book extraordinary.
Which was very, very helpful. The other is that, you know, this theme of reconciliation after divisive war, particularly the war that I knew, has been a theme of mine for 40 years. I was very concerned with that whole question coming out of the Army in 1968, became very involved with the amnesty movement for Vietnam War resistors, wrote a novel about it, came back to it as a historical question, the relationship between the aftermath of the Civil War to the aftermath of the Vietnam War. So it's been a long and important theme in my entire 40 years of work. But as well, I really wanted to tell as thoroughly as I possibly could the story of this friend of mine who trained with me in Army intelligence, who was killed in the Tet Offensive in the city of Hue on January the 30th, 50 years ago.
This is Ronald Ray.
Ronald Ray. And so it pleased me to be able to tell a story that had profound questions about how any nation memorializes a war that they've lost.
Mm-hmm. Usually they don't if they lose.
That's exactly right. How a lost war is to be memorialized is a very profound issue. And then there was this extraordinary competition for the commission for the Vietnam Memorial. So it had all these deep themes for me that really are of great concern to me for an awfully long time. And then overlaid on top of it was this amazing story about the competition, the winner, and then the blowback after.
There's a symmetry between, your book is almost two for the price of one, with the story of the memorial and the story of your friend. And then the memorial is two memorials in one in some ways.
Yes.
The competing designs.
Well, it's quite forgotten, I think, that this was a 5-year horrendous war over the making of that that memorial.
You call it an art war.
An art war, but almost a second Vietnam War, in which all the old issues of the war got refought in an artistic way. So that interested me a great deal. And then I was holed up at the Library of Congress for a year, and all of the materials were there, including all the 1,421 submissions to the competition. So I'm very, very pleased with how this came out.
The challenge of building a memorial for any war, win or lose, it's always a challenge. It's never easy. It's never getting everyone to agree. Right. This war in particular, because of the division within the country over it, was such a hornet's nest. How did we get to the idea of a contest to identify the design? Was it, and maybe we should even rewind the idea of a memorial in the first place. Does it begin with Jan Scruggs?
Yes, well, there's a personal way to tell it through Jan Scruggs, who is an extraordinary figure, who's just an enlisted man who was very, very badly wounded in Vietnam, and then, by his own admission, had a very bad case of PTSD. But in the late 1970s, decided that it was really important that, regardless of how any given GI felt about the war, that their service to the country should be memorialized in some way. Right? It was an obsession for him. And you know, he started with a few bucks of his own, and it became a movement, and became ultimately over that 5-year period as a really rather major political story in Washington. But he's the central figure. But the conflict between an abstract piece of art and a figurative piece of art, which is what we normally get when when military events are memorialized in some way or another, usually a soldier or a general on horseback or something like that. We've got a ton of them in Washington. It was really obviously concluded in this amazing competition that was not what was needed for this war. So there's the whole first phase of, you know, can you have a Vietnam memorial at all? Then there's the phase of what should it be? And then when it's decided by a very distinguished group of judges who the winner should be, then the blowback was just absolutely amazing.
And the jury of judges who decided on the winning design did not include a Vietnam veteran. Was that an oversight, or was that deliberate?
It's unclear how that happened. I think the way in which the jury was made was absolutely the appropriate one, to look for the most distinguished people in the artistic world who have very, very high standards of artistic excellence, to be the ultimate jury. So I don't think, you know, the fact that somebody was a veteran of Vietnam made any difference whatsoever. However, in the blowback of the whole thing, that became a major issue for those who hated the Maya Lin design, that they said, well, how would any of these people understand what Vietnam was like unless you know, but you know, how to find a Vietnam veteran who had that very high standard of artistic excellence was, I mean, there was just nobody that presented themselves.
I started to talk about, when you mentioned blowback, what Maya Lin, a 21-year-old at the time, endured was significant, and some of it was ugly.
Very ugly, and it was racist, it was misogynist, and yet there was something there that just rubbed people the wrong way, that for an Asian war, that an Asian woman should be the one to memorialize it. It was something that was picked up, and she was just reviled. What a strong woman she was, though, at age 21 and 22. I mean, it's an extraordinary story about a woman at that age who could stand toe-to-toe with the Ross Perot's of this world. Or
Ross Perot, one of the early funders.
That's right. Or Jim Webb, very powerful characters. And she just had this notion of the integrity of her artistic vision, and by God, she was just going to fight for it.
Now, the other artist who's part of this tale, Frederick Harsh, explain how he was involved with Jan Scruggs even before the competition, correct?
Yes, he's a very distinguished figurative artist. In some ways, he was a kind of a retrograde figure, going back to sort of the standards of medieval art. He was very much taken by, you know, figurative art in Florence, for example. And his sense of detail for all of his work is really brilliant and wonderful. He was not terribly well liked in the artistic community because the standards of art had changed in the late 70s and 80s. It was more to the abstract thing.
He was seen as old school?
He was very, very old school, and by gosh, he felt that, you know, the human body was beautiful, and he wanted to craft it beautifully, which he did in a number of instances. For those who live in Washington, his work in the Washington Cathedral over over the doors of the Washington Cathedral is, in a way, a story of success equivalent to Maya Lin's, that he won the competition to do that, very important piece of work as a young sculptor when very distinguished other sculptors were in the competition.
So he ends up contributing to the final memorial, the three soldiers sculpture that sits next to the deep V in the ground.
Yes.
Would it have reached the finish line, Maya Lin's design, if there hadn't been this sort of compromise of also adding a more traditional memorial?
Yeah, but it becomes a Washington story. It becomes a story of political compromise. And it's argued by some that Frederick Harker actually saved the memorial, saved its being built so that you had to have a sop to the veterans like Jim Webb that just absolutely hated the V, the black granite V below ground with just the names of the dead. That it needed something that accentuated service and sacrifice and duty and all of those normal values. So that became the crux of the debate. They were very lucky in having Frederick Hart to ultimately do those three soldiers, because he held off the pressure to do something heroic, something more traditional that we see so much in Washington. And so his figures are kind of amorphous. You don't really know what they're thinking, and it's left to the visitor to that extraordinary place to think that these are two separate memorials that don't really belong to one another, or that these are sort of symbolic of all who served in Vietnam, who are looking out at the enormous loss.
Do the critics persist to this day, in the sense that now if you go to the memorial, as you said, it's almost like a shrine-like experience?
It is, yeah.
And it's a beloved memorial in that way, and a very powerful one in that way.
Yeah.
Have they changed their mind over time, or are those who were critical then still critical today?
I don't know about Jim Webb, because he would not talk to me. But I should imagine that all of them basically see the amazing success of this thing, realize that it's not only hugely successful for the Vietnam War, but that it has grown in its significance over the years. As Vietnam recedes in our memory, it becomes a place of contemplation and spirituality, not just for Vietnam anymore. It really has become universalized to all wars.
One of the interesting elements of the book are the photos that you show of other designs, rejected designs or runner-up designs. Yeah. Do any of those stand out to you for any particular reason, either in the positive or the negative?
Well, there's a gallery in the book of about 18 of those. And I wanted that gallery to have some of the kooky things, right, and some of the less kooky, and some that were really serious contenders. As it turns out, Frederick Hart was in a group that was a very strong contender to have the memorial built, a kind of cove-like, horseshoe-like design that would have two of his statues looking at one another across a field. It was a very strong submission. But those who talked to me about that design ultimately felt that Maya Lin's was better. The simplicity won out.
You began by talking about your personal connection to this story, both as your service to military and the loss of your friend in the Tet Offensive that you write about eloquently in the book. An argument can be made that all books are autobiographical to some degree, right? It's one of the old sort of standard thoughts about writing.
Yes.
Is this book particularly personal for you, any more than your other 17 books?
Well, they're all personal. I don't really believe in objectivity for major writing. I mean, it's all through your own perspective. This subject about memorialization, about Vietnam, is very deep and personal for me. I had written about it in very different ways in the past. It didn't make sense to write about it now the way I had written it in the past, and it's as if the artistic conflict here was a gift, as a new way to look at this whole thing. And especially since we are now having a reconsideration of the Vietnam War through the documentary series, it's, you know, it just, writers always are looking for things to hook onto that are on people's minds at any given time. So I was just quite lucky or quite smart, whichever way you want to put it.
We'll be generous. We'll go with smart.
to start it 2.5 years ago, to position it so right at the point we're having this reconsideration.
A final thought, James, is about the Vietnamese perspective on memorializing this war, which you also touch on in your postscript. Could you talk to us about that?
Yes, well, I had never been to Vietnam. My 3 years in the military were stateside. That's probably a good thing in terms of being a writer later about it, because so many of the people who witnessed such horrible things in Vietnam, their thoughts are deep within them and they don't talk easily, much less write about it easily. So that was a good thing. I wanted to go to Vietnam particularly for that final chapter, to just be in a hotel room looking down on the very street where my friend was stationed, and to understand, or try to understand, what it would have been like when you're in a little villa with 6 other GIs that is 2 or 3 blocks away from the MACV compound in the city of Hue, and suddenly to have your amanuensis scream out that there are North Vietnamese and Viet Cong on the street, and to watch the waves of these soldiers come down. I wanted to be able to try to put myself in that position, and it seemed to me that it was an important thing for me to go to Vietnam. Now, since I was writing about memorialization, I was very interested in the way in which the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong memorialize also. And actually there are some cemeteries of North Vietnamese killed that are exquisitely beautiful, and in some ways influenced by Maya Lin. Because in one that I went to, they had a number of pagodas dotted around this cemetery. And in the pagodas would be a black granite piece of granite in which the names of the dead were inscribed. So it was another example, a specific example about Vietnam, but another example worldwide about the influence that Maya Lin has had on war memorialization per se.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for sharing with us about the book today, and congratulations on the book. Another terrific piece of work.
Thank you.
Always
so
look
much.
forward to your next.
Good deal. Hope there will be one. Thank you, John.